If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Lindell Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. Hello, and thanks for joining me for this episode. This week's been a pretty hectic one for me. I decided a few weeks ago to do some more study, and Brad's actually been away at firefighting training as well this week, so I've been more overloaded than usual, and I've just dropped some balls. But I'm super grateful that this podcast is a bouncy one, and even though I can't always get my episodes out on the day that I plan, I do usually get them out, even if they're a few days late. So today I thought I'd talk about ovulation test strips, and you might have heard them, be called OPKs, which is short for ovulation predictor kits, or maybe LH tests or ovulation tests. I'll just call them OPKs, but you can call them whatever works for you. So even if you don't use these, hopefully it's helpful to understand what they actually tell you. So even if you don't use these, hopefully this episode can give you a bit of an understanding about what they can actually tell you and what they can't, and some of the things that can affect, the result of these, and some of the things that can affect the result in case that you want to give them a go at some point. Because when you're trying to conceive, they are pretty easy things to try. They're cheap. Some of them are around under $1 per test if you buy them online and in bulk. And you can even get them without a prescription. You can just use them in the privacy of your own home. So when I started trying to conceive, I used the ones that you buy online in a bulk pack. They look pretty similar to a pregnancy test. They look pretty similar to a pregnancy test strip, and they show a positive result with just a second darker line. And I thought, it'd be pretty simple. And I thought, it'd be a pretty simple thing to do, right? You see people on social media or in forums making it look like it's a total breeze. You just pee on a stick, you get a positive, you have sex at the right time, and boom, you get a baby. But I didn't know back then, and when I first started trying, that I had PCOS, and that actually was something that could affect my luteinizing. And that was actually something that could affect my luteinizing hormone levels. And the amount of luteinizing hormone in your system is what these tests read. So and luteinizing hormone, it's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to say LH and hope that you can still follow along with what I'm saying. So in my situation, the OPKs on their own, they weren't actually enough. I needed blood tests and ultrasounds to actually know what was happening behind the scenes. My fertility specialist, he did occasionally actually use OPKs with me, even though he knew they might not be super reliable for me. But because he was also doing those blood tests and ultrasounds, he had a pretty good idea of when he thought that I would ovulate. But he just liked me to use them more on weekends when it was harder to get blood tests done to see if we could pick up my LH surge. It was basically just a gap filler for the days that getting scans and blood tests were tricky. And I think that can be kind of useful to know because an OPK can give you good information even if it doesn't tell you everything. So now's probably a good time to just touch on what an OPK actually is. And if you've not used one of these before, they're pretty simple. You basically collect some urine in a container, and either dip it straight into it or you use the stick in your urine stream, depending on which type of test that you're using. And the test is looking for LH, the luteinizing hormone in your urine. And when it gets to a certain level, the test will show you a positive result. But it can be pretty overwhelming when you go looking for OPKs because you can go from spending a couple of dollars to seeing what because you can go from spending a couple of dollars to seeing ones that cost almost an arm and a leg. You've got the cheaper bulk strips that you can buy online, which usually arrive, just as a bunch of small foil packets. And then you've got, the branded boxes from the pharmacy, which are often the digital ones, and they might have, a screen with a smiley face or a plus symbol, to show a positive result. If you use just the standard cheaper strips, you have to read the lines yourself to get a positive test. So if you use just, the standard cheapest, cheaper strips, you have to read the lines yourself. To get a positive, the test line needs to be as dark or darker than the control line. And this is a bit different to a pregnancy test, where any faint line means that you're pregnant. With these, the faint line is still a negative because you always have a bit of LH in your system anyway. And that can probably be one of the most annoying things about them because you're left squinting. And that can be one of the most annoying things about them because you're left squinting at two lines trying to figure out if. And that sometimes can be one of the most annoying things about them because you're left squinting, at two lines trying to figure out if it's actually dark enough. And often and that can be one of the most annoying things about them because you're left squinting at two lines trying to figure out if it's actually dark enough. And often I think it's why people end up taking photos, under your bathroom light and trying to compare yesterday's line to today's. So the digital ones can make this a bit easier because the test reads your result for you and then just gives you a symbol on the screen. But regardless of what test that you use, you are still just measuring LH. The digital test doesn't, suddenly know whether or not you've actually ovulated. It's just making the test easier to read. And something I found interesting was that when researchers compared these tests, the cheaper strips, they actually did just as well as the expensive ones. So I'd probably just recommend starting out with these cheaper strips if you want to use them and see how you go. You don't need to spend a fortune just to find out if your LH is rising. Plus, if your cycle's all over the place, you might be testing for weeks on end. So buying these expensive digital ones can get pricey pretty fast. If you find the lines hard to read, you might want to consider a digital one though. If you do find the lines hard to see though, you might want to consider a digital one and see if it makes it any easier for you to read. There's also now some newer urine tests, ones like Prove and Over, and they look at just more than luteinizing hormone. They're still home tests, but they measure other hormones like progesterone to confirm whether an egg was actually released, which just gives you more information than the OPK on its own. And there is actually research to show that OPKs can help increase your chances of getting pregnant. A big review done into this showed that women who used OPKs, they actually had sex less often. A big review of this showed that women who used OPKs actually had sex less often because they were just hitting the right window. But I do have a caveat. But in saying that, a lot of the research was also paid for by the companies making the tests, and other reviews said the data is pretty mixed. So using OPKs can't guarantee ovulation or pregnancy, but I do think that knowing when your LH is rising with OPKs and then timing sex can be more helpful than just simply guessing. Something that can be a bit confusing when you're trying to figure out which OPK option to go with is the numbers on the packet or the box. And I had no idea what these meant when I first started trying to conceive and when I started using OPKs. But you'll usually see a number followed by some letters like MIU or ML. The number might be something like 10 or 20 or 25. And the number attached to that might be something like 10, 25 or 40. That number basically tells you how much LH needs to be there before that specific test will pick it up. If you think of it like a threshold, a test that says 20 can a test that says 20 can detect a much lower amount of LH than one that says 40. So the lower the number, the more sensitive the test is, because it triggers a positive LH result at a much lower concentration. But being more sensitive doesn't automatically mean that it's better or more accurate for you. Because if your LH tends to sit a bit higher through your cycle, and this is quite common with things like PCOS, a super sensitive test might pick up those baseline levels too easily, and you might actually end up with a positive test when your body actually isn't ready to ovulate at all. It's just basically picking up your normal hormone level that sits higher than usual. It's just basically picking up your normal hormone level that sits. It's just picking up your normal hormone level. It's just picking up your LH level. It's just picking up your normal LH level that sits high. But that can give you a near constant dark line, and that can make results hard to figure out. Which is why I don't think there's one perfect test that works for everyone. It's really it's best to find the sensitivity level that works best with your body's baseline. Another helpful thing is knowing how concentrated your urine is. Another helpful thing is being aware of how concentrated your urine is when you're testing, which is something a lot of people don't realise when they use OPKs. If you've had a lot to drink, you're going to have more fluid in your bladder, so there's less LH in that particular catch. It doesn't mean drinking water lowers your LH levels in your bloodstream. Your body still is producing the exact same amount of LH. It's just that what you're testing isn't as concentrated because it's been watered down by that extra fluid. So it's possible to miss your surge on the test because the line doesn't get dark enough, even if your body has already started the surge. And the time when you do the test, that can also impact things because there's a bit of a lag between when your body starts the surge and when it's actually showing up in your urine. Most people start their LH surge fairly early in the morning. Most people start their LH surge early in the morning, but it can take a few hours for it to filter down through your kidneys and into your bladder. So that lag is pretty much why a lot of instructions suggest waiting until the afternoon to test. If you use the way that you do first thing in the morning, it's mostly been sitting in your bladder overnight, so that fresh morning LH surge won't have actually showed up in your urine yet. So you're essentially testing your urine from yesterday. And of course, everyone's different, and some people will surge later in the day anyway. But testing in the afternoon or early evening is usually the safest bet because it gives the LH a bit of time to show up no matter when your body started. The surge. You just want to avoid drinking heaps of water for a couple of hours before your test. You just want to avoid drinking a heap of water a couple of hours before you test. And if your cycles are irregular, there's another issue because you don't necessarily know when to start testing in your cycle. You can start too early and end up testing for ages, or start too late and miss the rise. And then a negative test can mean a couple of different things. It could mean that your LH hasn't risen yet and you need to keep testing, or it could mean you've missed the rise and ovulation has actually already happened. So when you're using OPKs, it can take a bit of time to work out what your own pattern looks like, and it can be a bit of a learning curve. And if your LH surge is short, testing once a day. Also, if your LH surge is short, testing once a day means that you could miss it. You might have a surge that lasts 2 or 3 days, while others only have a peak that lasts for a few hours. So if you're testing once every 24 hours, you could skip over that window and assume that you didn't surge at all that month. You could skip over that window and assume that you didn't actually surge at all that month. And I really struggled with all the guesswork around OPKs and found myself actually testing every couple of hours because I was trying to work out whether or not I was getting a positive at all. But I wouldn't suggest doing that because really it ended up being more stressful than helpful. Plus, if you test too often, your wee doesn't actually have time to get concentrated. Your urine doesn't have time to concentrate, so you're actually more likely to get a faint line and miss the peak anyway. So you don't need to spend a whole day looking at tests. But if you're at the point where you feel like you have to watch your OPKs multiple times a day just to see a darker line, or if you're testing and nothing seems to be coming up at all, that may be the point where it's best to stop guessing and bring in some help. There might just be too many variables to handle this on your own. And if you're wanting to go down the fertility specialist route, and if you're not wanting to go down the fertility specialist route, integrative doctors and naturopaths or fertility nurses, they can guide you well and help you figure things out, often at a root level. And if you are seeing an actual fertility specialist, ask them anything. That's what they're there for. And they have the tools to look at things more deeply than even just OPKs on their own. My specialist actually had me use and I mentioned before that my specialist had me using OPKs on weekends. And I mentioned before that my specialist had me using OPKs on weekends, even though he knew that they weren't fully reliable for my cycles. But he wasn't just trusting them blindly. He knew what they could do and what they couldn't. And that's how I try to look at all of this now. It's not so much about the brand you use or how much you spend. It's just about knowing what an OPK can actually tell you and what it can't. And so in wrapping up, what actually can OPKs tell you? Well, they're basically just picking up a rise in LH. When it spikes, it's usually your body signal that ovulation is about to happen in the next day or two. It gives you an idea that things are probably moving towards ovulation. And if your cycles are fairly regular, testing over a few months will probably start to show you a pattern. But there are a few things that OPKs also can't tell you. They can't confirm that an egg was actually released. A positive test just means that your LH has risen. It doesn't actually mean that you've ovulated. And for a lot of people, the LH surge and ovulation, they line up exactly like they're supposed to. But when you're dealing with fertility issues, things don't always go to plan behind the scenes. And this can happen with a condition called luteinized unruptured follicle syndrome. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically where your body triggers a normal LH surge, but the follicle on your ovary doesn't burst open. The egg gets physically trapped inside, so even though you got that dark line, nothing actually releases. And because the follicle being released isn't something that OPKs track, they won't pick it up. So if you're getting clear positives every month and you're still not getting pregnant, it doesn't mean that your tests are faulty. They probably are. They're accurately tracking your LH rise. There just might be something else going on in the background that an OPK can't tell you. And I think that's the main thing worth taking from this. Not which test you use or which brand or scrap that. And so if you don't have PCOS or any other condition that makes ovulation harder to predict, there's a good chance that a basic OPK might be all you need. If it works for you simply, that's great. Use it, trust your cycle patterns, and don't feel like you need to overcomplicate something that's already giving you what you need. And if it doesn't, just know that it's not a failure on your part. It might just mean that it's time to bring in some more help. Well, that pretty much wraps up today's episode. So thank you so much for listening. I hope it was helpful. And we'll see you next time. Bye. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.